They called it a joke. When the first M4 Shermans rolled onto North African soil in late 1942, even Allied soldiers whispered doubts. To the Germans, it was laughable. A boxy, tall, gasoline-powered target that looked clumsy next to the sleek, deadly Panzers. Its armor was thin, its guns small, its silhouette impossible to miss. In the desert's harsh sun, the Sherman's green paint blistered and peeled, its engines overheated, and its crews joked that the tank burned too easily. The German Afrika Korps called it the Tommy Cooker, a grim nickname suggesting that one hit was all it took to turn its crew into fire. Yet beneath the laughter, something deeper was taking shape, an idea that would eventually crush that very arrogance beneath steel and numbers. The Sherman wasn't designed to be the biggest or the strongest. It was designed to be enough, fast enough to move where needed, simple enough to fix anywhere, and cheap enough to build by the tens of thousands. While the Germans obsessed over engineering perfection, America embraced practicality. The Sherman could be built in a car factory, shipped across oceans, repaired in the field with spare parts that fit like clockwork. In an age of overcomplication, it was simplicity that would become the Allies' greatest weapon. But in those early days, no one believed it. The first engagements against German tanks were brutal. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, the Sherman's 75-millimeter gun failed to penetrate the armor of the Panzer IVs and Tigers that faced it. American crews fired in desperation, only to watch their shells bounce harmlessly away. When the counterfire came, it came like thunder. German shells slicing through Sherman hulls, igniting fuel and ammunition. Smoke rose over the Tunisian hills, and laughter followed from German tank commanders who believed they were invincible. Yet even amid defeat, something remarkable happened. The Shermans that survived were repaired overnight. New tanks arrived by the hundreds, shipped in convoys across the Atlantic. What Germany destroyed in days, America replaced in hours. For every Tiger built, the U.S. built 20 Shermans. The German engineers refined brilliance. The Americans refined efficiency. And soon those laughable tanks began to learn. Crews adapted, tactics evolved. The Sherman was no longer fighting alone. It fought as part of a system, with air support, mobile artillery, and endless logistical power behind it. By the spring of 1943, in the dunes of Tunisia, the tide began to shift. What no one realized yet, not the Allies, not the Germans, was that this unassuming tank, dismissed as a rolling coffin, would soon become the engine of Allied victory across 3 continents. When the dust settled over North Africa, a lesson had been burned into the minds of every Allied commander. The Sherman's strength was not in single combat, it was in unity. In one-on-one duels, the German Tigers and Panthers ruled the battlefield. But wars were not won by duels. They were won by persistence, supply, and the ability to keep fighting when the enemy ran out of breath. The Americans understood this faster than anyone. By mid-1943, as the Allies prepared for the invasion of Sicily, U.S. and British factories were turning out Sherman tanks faster than the Germans could destroy them. The design was standardized, production streamlined, and spare parts interchangeable across thousands of vehicles. It was a miracle of modern industry, one that no other nation on Earth could match. A single German Tiger tank took months to build, requiring master craftsmen and limited resources. A Sherman rolled off an assembly line in less than a week. The difference wasn't just mechanical, it was philosophical. When the landings in Sicily began, Shermans led the charge across beaches and narrow mountain passes. They bogged down, broke down, and burned. But they kept coming. In the dust-choked valleys of Troina and along the Sicilian roads lined with olive trees, the Germans saw something they hadn't faced before, an enemy that didn't stop. For every Sherman knocked out, another appeared on the horizon. It was the birth of a new kind of warfare, industrial warfare, where endurance outweighed elegance. And the Sherman was evolving. Mechanics in the field welded extra armor, adjusted gear ratios, and learned to angle their hulls against German shells. Crews grew smarter, faster, more ruthless. They knew their weaknesses, the high silhouette, the thin plating, but they also knew their strengths. The 75-millimeter gun, though underpowered against heavy armor, could fire high explosive rounds devastating against infantry anti-tank guns, and fortifications. In combined arms operations, that mattered far more than sheer firepower. Still, the tank's reputation lagged behind its growing effectiveness. Even Allied soldiers joked about their Ronsons, named after the cigarette lighter that lights up every time. They learned to store ammunition differently, to add wet racks to prevent fires, to turn vulnerability into experience. The Sherman wasn't a perfect tank. It was a survivor's tank. As the Allies pushed from Sicily into Italy, the Shermans became a common sight in every engagement. They clawed through mud and rain, climbed steep hills, and rolled through villages shattered by artillery. Against every obstacle, they did what they were designed to do. They kept moving. Meanwhile, German intelligence officers wrote reports describing an endless stream of Shermans arriving on every front. What began as laughter was turning into unease. For the first time, the vaunted precision of German industry began to tremble under the weight of Allied production. The tide had not yet turned, but it was beginning to move. By early 1944, the Sherman was no longer just a tank. It was a symbol of unstoppable momentum. Wherever the Allies advanced, the Sherman was there, its tracks cutting deep into the soil of Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. For all its flaws, it had become the spine of Allied armor. The Germans still mocked it, calling it weak, thin-skinned, and crude. But the mockery had a nervous edge now. They were starting to see the truth. Quantity, when properly organized, had a quality all its own. In Italy, the Sherman proved its worth in some of the most brutal terrain imaginable. Mountain passes, river crossings, and muddy fields that swallowed heavier tanks whole. The M4 kept moving when others stalled. Mechanics could fix it in hours, not days. Spare engines, wheels, and transmissions were shipped in crates stacked like bricks across every port. Each crew carried the confidence that if their tank was lost, another waited just behind it. For the Germans, every destroyed Sherman was replaced before the smoke had cleared. For the Allies, the war was now one of endurance, not perfection. Behind the front lines, American factories thundered without pause. Women riveted armor plates while teenagers welded gun mantlets and laid tracks. At its peak, U.S. production rolled out nearly 2,000 Shermans a month. Each tank was a promise, a moving declaration that the war could be fought and won through sheer persistence. The Tiger and Panther might win the duel, but they could not win the war against an army that could never be exhausted. As the Allies prepared for the invasion of France, the Shermans stood ready in vast numbers. Thousands waiting on English soil, engines idling in depots, hulls lined up like dominoes stretching into fog. Commanders studied the failures of past engagements and adjusted their strategy. The Shermans would not face German tanks head-on whenever possible. Instead, they would move as part of a larger machine, with artillery, infantry, and most importantly, the sky. For the Sherman was never truly alone. Allied air power, the P-47 Thunderbolt, the Typhoon, the Mustang, became its invisible armor. Together, they created a deadly partnership that would soon redefine the battlefield. The Sherman didn't need to be perfect. It only needed to survive long enough for the airmen above to finish what it started. And across the channel, German officers were reading intercepted reports about American tank strength. They laughed at the idea of facing thousands of Shermans in Normandy. "Let them come," one commander said confidently. "We'll burn them as we always have." But as June 1944 approached, that laughter would be drowned out by the thunder of engines, the roar of artillery, and the grinding steel of a tide that could no longer be stopped. The Sherman was coming, and with it, the beginning of Germany's end. Dawn broke over Normandy on June 6, 1944, beneath a sky filled with the drone of engines and the echo of history being written. As the first waves of Allied troops stormed the beaches, behind them waited the machines that would carry the liberation forward. The M4 Shermans. They rolled off landing craft and through the surf, their treads churning sand and seawater, their crews bracing for fire. For many, it was their first taste of real combat. For the Germans watching from the bluffs, it was the moment the laughing stopped. The Sherman had arrived in Europe in force. Hundreds came ashore that day and in the weeks that followed. Not perfect machines, but relentless ones. The chaos of D-Day was a brutal proving ground. Many tanks were lost before their guns ever fired, swallowed by the sea or caught in minefields. But for every Sherman that burned, two more landed the next morning. Within days, the hedgerows of Normandy trembled under the weight of American steel. The first encounters with German armor were vicious. The panthers and tigers waited in ambush, hidden behind thick hedges and stone walls. Their high-velocity 75mm and 88mm guns tore through Shermans with ease. Entire platoons could be lost in seconds. Survivors learned quickly to move fast, to flank, to use artillery and air power as their shield. The Sherman crews called for jabos, the fighter bombers above, to strike enemy positions before the German tanks could aim. The cooperation between tank and sky became the Allies' deadliest advantage. The Germans continued to mock the Sherman's inferiority, but they failed to see the larger pattern forming. Every time a Tiger destroyed a Sherman, another column arrived to replace it. And while a Tiger might take an hour to refuel and rearm, Shermans were already pushing forward, supported by mobile repair crews and endless convoys of spare parts. Germany's armored elite was fighting an enemy that never seemed to tire, never seemed to run out. By mid-July, the bocage country of Normandy became a grinding battlefield where the Sherman's agility and numbers finally began to pay off. Crews welded extra armor plates, used sandbags, even steel tracks for protection. Mechanics worked in open fields under artillery fire, bringing damaged tanks back into the fight within hours. The Sherman, once derided as a disposable weapon, was now proving itself indestructible in spirit, if not in armor. The breakthrough came with Operation Cobra. Thousands of Allied aircraft carpet-bombed German positions, and behind that storm of fire, hundreds of Shermans advanced as one massive steel wave. German lines shattered. The panzers, outnumbered and outflanked, began to fall back. Villages long occupied by German forces were liberated one by one. When the German commanders radioed back to headquarters, their reports were filled not with triumph, but disbelief. "We destroy them," one officer said, "and still they come." The laughter that had begun in Africa was gone now. In its place was something new: fear. As the Allies pushed deeper into France, the Sherman became more than a weapon. It became a statement of inevitability. The Germans could destroy 10, 20, even 50 in a single day, but for every Sherman knocked out, new ones rolled off the assembly lines thousands of miles away. They came by ship, by train, by endless convoys winding through Normandy's narrow lanes. Villagers watched them pass, long columns of tanks, their engines rumbling like thunder, each one carrying 5 men who understood they were part of something larger than themselves. By August 1944, the Allies had broken through the German defenses. In the wide open countryside of France, the Sherman finally had the battlefield it was built for: speed and coordination, not ambush and attrition. Divisions of Shermans raced eastward in sweeping maneuvers, cutting off retreating German forces. What the Tiger and Panther could not do in numbers, the Sherman did in motion. It was fast, reliable, and seemingly everywhere at once. American and British crews learned to adapt their tactics against the superior German armor. Shermans worked in groups, circling their heavier opponents, calling for artillery strikes and air support. They knew they couldn't win by armor or gun alone. They won by teamwork, by communication, by the overwhelming force of the Allied machine. Pilots in P-47 Thunderbolts and Typhoons began to call the Shermans their brothers below. Together they formed a new kind of warfare where every part of the army, air, ground, and logistics moved as one living organism. For the first time since 1940, the Wehrmacht was on the run. The German army's once perfect coordination began to collapse under the pressure of constant movement and relentless pursuit. The Shermans didn't rest. Even when fuel ran low or engines overheated, the crews improvised, siphoning fuel, cannibalizing parts from wrecked tanks, repairing on the move. Each tank was a workshop, a home, and a weapon combined, a symbol of resourcefulness as much as firepower. In one small village near Falaise, a German officer reportedly watched through binoculars as column after column of Shermans rolled over the ridge toward his trapped division. "It was like watching the tide," he later wrote. "We fought the ocean with stones." When the Falaise pocket closed, tens of thousands of German troops were cut off. Allied tanks sealed the escape routes, firing on convoys from the high ground, crushing resistance with a scale of force the enemy could no longer match. The road to Paris was open. As the first Shermans rumbled into the capital on August 25th, Parisians filled the streets, climbing onto the tanks, waving flags and cheering the soldiers inside. For many, the sight of those machines meant liberation itself. The same tank once mocked as weak and expendable now rolled through the heart of Europe as the banner of freedom. In Berlin, the German High Command received the reports in silence. The Tiger was powerful, the Panther was elegant, but both were trapped in a war the Sherman had already transformed. And somewhere in the dust of Normandy, a burned-out Sherman rested beside the road, its turret blown open, its paint scorched black. Yet even in ruin, it had served its purpose. Because for every one destroyed, 10 more were coming. Autumn settled over Europe, and with it came the relentless grind of the Allied advance. By late 1944, the Sherman had crossed France, liberated Belgium, and now stood on the doorstep of Germany itself. Its crews were veterans now, hardened, clever, and painfully aware of their machine's strengths and weaknesses. They no longer joked about their Ronsons. They knew what their tank could do, and they trusted it. The laughter of the enemy had faded into the sound of retreating engines and the rumble of 1,000 Shermans rolling east. Still, the fighting was far from easy. In the forests of the Ardennes, the Sherman met its greatest trial. The German counteroffensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge caught the Allies by surprise. Out of the snow and fog came Tigers, Panthers, and Jagdpanthers, machines built for annihilation. The Sherman was outgunned and outarmored once again, and for a time it seemed the old laughter might return. But this time the Shermans fought differently. Their crews knew better than to duel the German giants head-on. They struck from the flanks, from behind trees, from the cover of ruined villages. Artillery and air power filled the gaps that armor could not. Where one Sherman fell, another maneuvered to strike. They were learning the very tactics that would define modern mechanized warfare: flexibility, coordination, and speed over brute strength. One American commander later recalled, "The Tiger was a beast, but it couldn't be everywhere. We could." That was the truth of it. The Germans fought with power. The Allies fought with presence. Every destroyed Sherman was immediately replaced, and every road soon filled with more. Their supply lines stretched back across the Channel and the Atlantic, a living artery of steel and will. By January 1945, the counterattack had failed. German fuel was gone, their tanks abandoned in the snow. Allied Shermans rolled through the wreckage, not because they were invincible, but because they had endured. The men inside them were tired, filthy, and cold, but they understood what their machines represented. The Sherman was never meant to be a perfect tank. It was meant to win a war of exhaustion, and that was exactly what it was doing. In captured German documents, Allied intelligence officers found bitter admissions. One report from the front read, "We destroy their tanks. They return with more. Our weapons are superior, but we cannot match their numbers nor their speed." Another officer wrote simply, "Their tank is everywhere." Even the feared German Tiger battalions were beginning to crumble, their precious machines sidelined for lack of parts, fuel, and time. The Sherman, meanwhile, moved forward like a tide that refused to recede. In towns across Belgium and Luxembourg, villagers gathered to watch the green columns roll by, worn, muddy, and dented, but unbroken. A farmer in Bastogne reportedly saluted one passing tank and said, "You look tired, but you are still standing." It was true of both the men and the machine. By the time the snow began to melt, the Sherman was no longer underestimated. The Allies had proven what the Germans had refused to believe, that in modern war, perfection was less powerful than persistence. By the spring of 1945, the Sherman had become an unstoppable presence, a rolling emblem of Allied determination. Its engines growled through the forests of the Rhineland, its treads grinding the remnants of the Reich beneath them. For every Tiger that stood in its path, 10 Shermans advanced. For every Panther that fired, the sky above answered with bombs and rockets. The Germans had built monsters. The Allies had built an army. Crossing the Rhine was the final test. Engineers threw bridges across the river under constant fire, and the first Shermans thundered over them, water glinting beneath their tracks. The crews were weary. Many had fought since Africa or Italy. But there was no hesitation. The same tank that had once burned in Tunisia and bogged down in Normandy was now rolling toward the heart of Germany itself. Its shape was familiar, its flaws unchanged, but its reputation utterly transformed. The laughter of 1942 was long forgotten. As Allied forces advanced deeper into Germany, towns fell one after another. The Sherman was everywhere, leading columns through shattered streets, pushing across open plains, and forcing crossings under smoke and artillery fire. German civilians watched the columns pass, astonished at their sheer number. To them, the tanks seemed endless, an iron river flowing east. And for the German soldiers who still resisted, the sight of that endless tide broke something inside them. They no longer saw a weak machine, they saw inevitability. In the ruins of Cologne, one of the war's most famous duels unfolded. A lone Panther tank lay in wait as Shermans entered the city. The Panther fired first, destroying the lead tank in a burst of flame. The remaining Shermans maneuvered through debris and smoke, their guns steady, their crews calm. One flanked the Panther, firing from the side, piercing its armor, and setting it ablaze. The moment was captured on film, a silent, grainy testament to the Sherman's evolution from underdog to equal. Meanwhile, the Allied armies kept advancing. The Red Army was approaching Berlin from the east, and the Western Allies pressed from the west. Everywhere, Shermans carried the fight forward. They ferried infantry, smashed through barricades, and cleared out pockets of resistance. Crews painted names and slogans on their armor. Lucky Lady, Vera, Thunderbolt, symbols of pride born from struggle. One veteran later said, "You could feel the machine's heartbeat when you drove it. It wasn't just metal, it felt alive, and perhaps in a way it was." Each Sherman represented hundreds of workers, thousands of hands, and an idea forged across oceans. That freedom, massed and determined, could outlast tyranny no matter how powerful. By March 1945, as American forces breached the Siegfried Line, German officers no longer mocked the Sherman. They feared it. They called it the Swarm, a weapon that was not one machine, but a system, a force of nature built from production, planning, and will. The tide that had begun in North Africa had reached its final flood. The machine, once scorned as weak now, rolled through the heart of the Reich, its engines echoing like a verdict. By April 1945, the war in Europe was collapsing, and the Sherman was at the center of it all. The tank that had once been dismissed as fragile and unremarkable now formed the backbone of the Allied advance. From the fields of the Ruhr to the suburbs of Berlin, its tracks carved the final paths of the conflict. Everywhere it went, the end of the Reich followed in its wake. The German army that had once mocked the Sherman's simplicity was now fighting with desperation. Fuel shortages crippled their armored divisions. Many of their precious Tigers and Panthers stood abandoned by the roadside, engines dry, tracks broken, their crews scattered. The Sherman, meanwhile, kept moving, powered by an endless supply chain that stretched back to the factories of Detroit, Cleveland, and Chicago. Each time a tank was lost, another arrived to replace it, as if the Allies were conjuring steel from thin air. In the ruined towns of Western Germany, civilians watched in stunned silence as columns of Shermans rolled through the streets. They were battered, mud-caked, and scarred from months of fighting, but they moved with purpose. Behind their armor rode the confidence of victory. For the crews inside, every mile forward carried ghosts, friends left behind in burning hulls, comrades lost on foreign soil, but also the unshakable belief that this journey would end with peace. In early April at Remagen, Shermans crossed the Ludendorff Bridge over the Rhine, one of the last intact crossings into the German heartland. When the bridge finally collapsed days later, it no longer mattered. Thousands of Shermans had already crossed, and pontoon bridges followed in their wake. The Rhine, once the natural fortress of Germany, had been conquered by perseverance. In the Ruhr pocket, encircled German forces tried to break out, but found themselves surrounded by waves of American armor. The Shermans spearheaded the assault, flanking, dividing, isolating the enemy until resistance crumbled. Within weeks, over 300,000 German soldiers had surrendered. The myth of German invincibility died there, under the relentless grind of the Allied war machine. And yet the Sherman's victory was not one of dominance, but of endurance. It did not defeat the Tiger through thicker armor or a bigger gun, but through resilience and cooperation. The tank, the mechanic, the pilot, and the soldier all working as one. It was the embodiment of Allied unity, American industry, British adaptation, Canadian grit, and Polish, French and free European courage. Together they had turned ridicule into triumph. As the Allies advanced toward Berlin, the Sherman led the way into towns where the war had begun years earlier. In one small village, a captured German officer reportedly stared at a line of Shermans passing by and muttered, "We used to laugh at them." No one laughed now. The echoes of that old arrogance were buried beneath the sound of engines and the clatter of victory. By the final weeks of April 1945, the war's end was no longer a question, only a matter of days. The once feared German war machine had broken apart, and the M4 Sherman was now rolling through the ruins of a defeated empire. Town after town surrendered at the sight of its familiar silhouette. The tank that had once been dismissed as a crude mass production experiment now represented liberation itself. Columns of Shermans moved eastward under spring rain, their tracks grinding through shattered streets lined with civilians holding white flags. In every direction, the sound of surrender drowned out the echoes of battle. But the crews inside those tanks were not celebrating. They had seen too much. Many of them had fought from Tunisia to Normandy, from the hedgerows to the Ardennes. The war that the Sherman had carried them through had cost countless lives. Friends lost in burning hulls, tanks destroyed, victories paid for with fire. Yet still the machine endured. Mechanics, exhausted and covered in grease, kept them running day and night. Supply convoys stretched for miles, bringing spare engines and ammunition to the front. The Sherman was more than a tank now. It was a symbol of endurance, of what happens when willpower becomes industrial. The Germans had fought with masterpieces. The Allies had fought with determination. In the end, determination won. In early May, Sherman tanks rolled through towns near the Elbe River, where American and Soviet forces would soon meet. It was a strange moment. Two armies from opposite worlds, bound together by the same cause, closing the last chapter of the deadliest war in history. Shermans and T-34s parked side by side, their crews shaking hands, smiling through exhaustion. One American tanker, staring at the Soviet machines, reportedly laughed softly. "They laughed at ours too," he said. When word came that Hitler was dead, the crews barely reacted. For them, the war had ended long before Berlin fell. It ended in the moments between battles, in the faces of civilians freed from occupation, in the quiet realization that their journey and their tanks had carried them across continents. As victory parades formed in the West, the Sherman became a fixture of celebration. Children climbed onto its turret, waving flags. Soldiers posed beside it for photographs. The same tank that had been mocked as weak now stood in the heart of liberated cities as the symbol of freedom's strength. German engineers who had once sneered at its simplicity later admitted grudging respect. They studied captured Shermans after the war, astonished by their reliability, their efficient design, and their ease of production. "They won because they built more," one German officer said after the surrender, "but they also built smart." And so the laughter that began in North Africa ended in silence, replaced by acknowledgement. The Sherman had outlasted its critics, outperformed its reputation, and outlived the empire that once scorned it. In the final days of the war, as Allied columns rolled through the heart of Germany, a single Sherman rumbled to a halt beside a destroyed Tiger. Its crew climbed out, standing quietly in the evening light. One of them looked at the wreck beside them, that proud, monstrous machine, and said only, "You were strong, but we were endless." When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Europe was a continent of ashes, and among those ashes stood the M4 Sherman, battered, scarred, and immortal. It had survived everything that war could throw at it: deserts, snowfields, cities, and the mocking laughter of those who once believed it beneath them. Yet it was still there, engines humming softly in the spring air, carrying home the men who had lived to see victory. The Sherman had not been the best tank of the war. It had never pretended to be. It could not outshoot a tiger or outlast a panther in single combat, but it had done something greater. It had endured, adapted, and multiplied until the world itself bent beneath its weight. It was the tank of the citizen soldier, the embodiment of a nation's industrial will. It represented not perfection, but persistence, the belief that what mattered was not how many times you fell, but how many times you stood back up. In the months after the war, as the world rebuilt, the Sherman rolled again, not as a weapon of conquest, but as a guardian of peace. It served in the armies of liberated nations, in training grounds, and in parades celebrating freedom. Some were shipped to distant continents, fighting new wars in Korea, Israel, and beyond. The design that had once been laughed at became a global standard, the tank that taught the world that utility and endurance were as mighty as brilliance. Historians would later debate its legacy. Some called it a soldier's tank, others a death trap. But those who had driven it, who had fought inside its metal walls, heard the ricochet of shells and smelled the cordite after each shot, knew the truth. The Sherman had been their lifeline. It was the reason they reached Berlin, the reason they came home. In museums today, the M4 stands quietly under soft light, its paint restored, its scars preserved. Visitors walk past, reading plaques about armor thickness and gun caliber. Few notice the dents that tell older stories, the hits it survived, the battles it endured, the stubbornness that made it outlive everything that mocked it. The laughter that had once followed the Sherman across the deserts of Africa and the fields of Europe has long since faded into history. What remains is respect, not just for the tank, but for what it represented, the triumph of practicality over pride, teamwork over ego, and endurance over despair. A German veteran years later summed it up with quiet honesty. "Our Tigers were magnificent," he said, "but they died with us. The Shermans lived on, and that was the final victory, not in destruction, but in survival. The Sherman did not win because it was invincible. It won because it refused to stop moving. From the sands of El Alamein to the ruins of Berlin, the tank they laughed at became the machine that turned the tide of war. Not through fear, but through faith, through effort, through sheer, unrelenting will. The M4 Sherman never sought glory. It simply did its job, again and again and again, until the world was free. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.